At first glance, this photo might look completely innocent. The man in the photo, Issei Sagawa, is a celebrity who has written many restaurant reviews for the Japanese magazine Spa. What could be so bad about a photo of a food reviewer eating food? Well, there's a very disturbing answer to that question. Issei Sagawa was born prematurely on April 26 of 1949 in Kobe, Hyogo Prefecture, Japan, to his very wealthy parents. His father, Akira Sagawa, was a successful businessman who had been the president of Kurita Water Industries. As a result of his premature birth, Issei suffered from numerous health issues and could not participate in normal childhood life, which caused him to develop an extremely introverted personality. He became obsessed with literature, but his lack of socialization soon manifested in much more harmful ways. According to Issei himself, he committed bestiality on the family dog and experienced cannibalistic desires, specifically for women. In 1973, Issei was attending Waco University in Tokyo when he decided to follow a German woman to her home. He broke into the woman's apartment while she was sleeping, but she woke up and fought him off. The police arrived on scene and promptly arrested Issei, charging him with attempted SA. However, SA had never been Issei's goal. His intention had been to consume the woman's flesh. He never revealed this information to the police, and his parents got the charges dismissed after paying the victim's family a substantial settlement. In 1977, Issei moved to France in order to pursue a PhD in literature at the Sorbonne in Paris, but his other interests had also followed him to his new home. According to Issei, almost every night I would bring a prostitute home and then try to shoot them, but for some reason my fingers froze up and I couldn't pull the trigger. However, this hesitancy was not destined to last. On June 11th of 1981, Issei invited a Dutch classmate named René Hartevelt to dinner at his apartment. He told René that they could translate poetry together for their upcoming homework assignment, but Issei had other plans. René began reading poetry at a desk with her back to Issei, which allowed him to take his rifle and shoot her in the back of the neck. He fainted from the shock at what he had done, but after waking up he realized that he needed to continue his plan. He violated the corpse before leaving his apartment and purchasing a butcher knife. Issei proceeded to devour René's body in a cannibalistic frenzy. When he was done, he attempted to dump the remains in a nearby lake. However, Issei was caught in the act, resulting in the police arresting him 4 days later. Issei's father provided an expensive lawyer for the defense. After waiting for his trial for 2 years, Issei was found legally insane and unfit to stand trial. The judge ordered him to be held indefinitely at a mental institution. While residing at the institution, an author named Inuhiko Yumota visited Issei and wrote an account of the murder, which he published in Japan. The fame that Issei accumulated as a result caused the French authorities to deport him back to Japan, where he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. The psychologists determined that Issei was perfectly sane and that sexual perversion had been his motive. However, the French authorities had dropped the charges against him as a result of their insanity decision, so the court documents were sealed and were never released to the Japanese authorities. As a consequence of this, the Japanese police had absolutely no legal right to detain Issei, and on August 12th of 1986, the cannibal walked free. Issei's freedom was heavily criticized by many, but he was also invited to be a guest speaker on TV programs, and he wrote books about his crime. As I mentioned earlier, he became a restaurant reviewer, a move that some people think was meant to rub salt in the wound of René's family. His writing eventually lost its impact and publishers stopped accepting his work. Issei's parents passed away in 2005, after which he moved into public housing and received welfare. In a 2011 interview, Issei complained about how difficult it was to find a job as a known murderer and cannibal, but nobody was sympathetic. In 2013, he suffered a cerebral infarction, which permanently damaged his nervous system. His brother was forced to provide daily care, and Issei eventually passed away from pneumonia in 2022. I can confidently say that he will not be missed, but this photograph remains as a terrifying reminder of what happens when certain people give in to their deepest and darkest desires. In 2014, John Hruby was the owner of a newspaper in the town of Marlow, Oklahoma. His family, including his son Alan, lived in the town of Duncan, Oklahoma. John's wife, Catherine, also worked for the newspaper, which was called the Marlow Review. Alan was a 19-year-old political science major at Oklahoma University, but the young man was starting to make a name for himself in a very bad way. Just a year prior, he had used his grandmother's name to obtain a credit card, which he used while on vacation in Europe to rack up $5,000 worth of charges. In February of 2014, a judge sentenced Alan to probation, and he was also made to attend alcohol and drug counseling. On the weekend of October 10th to 12th, Alan violated his probation by driving to Dallas, Texas in order to watch a football game. Alan snapped this photo while staying at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where he partied all weekend long. However, the story is much darker than a simple case of a teenage delinquent. The real reason Alan took this photograph was because he needed an alibi. On October 10th, the day that Alan left his home to go to Dallas, an employee of the Marlow Review became concerned when John and Catherine failed to show up for work. This employee, Todd Brooks, attempted to communicate with his boss, but he received nothing in return. When October 13th rolled around and there was still nothing but silence from John and Catherine, Todd's worries increased. However, nothing would happen until the Hruby family's house cleaner showed up at their home and discovered the dead bodies of John and Catherine, as well as their 17-year-old daughter. They had each been shot in the head. On October 15th, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation officers arrested Alan for violating the terms of his probation, but the interrogation focused on the murder of his family. Alan eventually confessed. In early October, Alan had stolen his father's 9mm handgun from the family pickup truck, then used it to end the lives of his parents and sister. He told the authorities that he had left his cell phone at Oklahoma University so that the detectives would see it ping there, and he had removed the DVR from his family's surveillance system. He disposed of the DVR and murder weapon in a nearby lake. After this, he departed for Dallas. When the authorities asked him why he had committed such a horrible crime, Alan said that he wanted to inherit his parents' estate because he was $3,000 in debt to a loan shark. Alan was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and was denied bail. The prosecutor stated that he would pursue the death penalty, and Alan said that he welcomed it. In 2015, he wrote a letter about the murders to the Oklahoman newspaper, saying, "I didn't feel like myself that day. What occurred was so horrible, the death penalty is deserved." In 2016, Alan pled guilty to all 3 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for life in prison. Hans-Jürgen Rosner was born on February 17th of 1957 in Gladbeck, Germany. He had 4 siblings and a very abusive father. At around 8 or 9 years old, Rosner learned how to shoplift, and his first theft conviction occurred when he was 14 years old. By the time he left his teenage years behind, Rosner had racked up numerous other charges for theft and burglary, and he had spent a total of 11 years in prison. In August of 1986, Rosner was granted a temporary release from prison, but he escaped and went into hiding. A year later, he moved in with his girlfriend Marion, and the police received a tip about the living situation from Rosner's ex-wife Ursula. A plan was hatched to arrest Rosner on August 16th of 1988. Dieter Degowski was born on June 4th of 1956 in Gladbeck, the 5th out of 6 children. Much like Rosner, he was abused during childhood, which caused him to develop violent tendencies. In his early teen years, Degowski committed numerous minor crimes and was first arrested at 15 years old for stealing sedatives. After getting out, he turned his criminal activities to bigger targets, stealing cars and developing an addiction to alcohol and sedatives. In 1983, Rosner and Degowski shared a prison cell in Verl Prison for 8 months, and Degowski agreed to be Rosner's accomplice for an upcoming bank robbery. The robbery was set to take place on August 16th of 1988, the same day that the police were planning to arrest Rosner. At 7:55 a.m. that day, Rosner and Degowski broke into a local branch of the Deutsche Bank in Gladbeck. They were each armed with a handgun and 350 rounds of ammunition. They held the bank employees at gunpoint, and the employees handed over 120,000 Deutschmarks. At 8:04 a.m., a witness called the police, and the robbers noticed a parked police car as they were leaving the bank. After this, they turned around and re-entered the bank, where they took 2 bank employees hostage. They demanded a car and ransom money while firing their weapons into the air. A journalist named Hans Meiser, who was working for a radio station at the time, called the bank and began interviewing the robbers. Over the course of the next few hours, negotiations resulted in the perpetrators receiving 300,000 Deutschmarks and a getaway car, both of which were delivered by an unarmed police officer. The car had been secretly outfitted with tracking devices and recording equipment. At 9:45 a.m., the robbers took their 2 hostages to the getaway vehicle. The police had assumed that the robbers would release the hostages and flee on their own, so the situation was poorly monitored at the time. Rosner and Degowski proceeded to drive around Gladbeck for several hours, stocking up on food and alcohol from local stores. Rosner suspected that the car contained listening devices, so they started looking for a different vehicle to use. First, he entered a pub and demanded the keys to a car that was parked outside, but nobody responded. Second, they went to a gas station and Rosner mugged a police officer, stealing his weapon and radio. After this, they successfully stole 2 cars, which they eventually abandoned out of fear that the police had planted them as decoys. Finally, they stole the 3rd car that they decided to make their getaway in. Ironically, the 2 cars they had ditched were not planted by the police, but the one they settled on was planted by the police. Before leaving town, they picked up Marion, Rosner's girlfriend. With the hostages still inside the vehicle, they drove to the town of Hagen in western Germany, making frequent stops at rest areas along the way. In the early morning hours of August 17th, Rosner and Degowski arrived in the district of Vegesack in the city of Bremen. Rosner and Marion left the car to visit Marion's family and shop in a commercial complex, while Degowski stayed behind to guard the hostages. The Bremen police were aware of the robbers' presence, and they set up officers to watch the vehicle. However, the robbers thought that they had thrown the police off their scent, so their guard was down, and Degowski left the hostages alone at one point so he could use the bathroom. Despite this, the police refused to act out of fear of endangering the hostages, and the hostages themselves also did not move. By the time the robbers had gotten back on the road, police reinforcements had arrived, but they had difficulty navigating the unfamiliar streets of Bremen. During that day, several camera crews were able to track down the robbers, and they broadcast footage of their car to the public. Rosner and Degowski attempted to reopen negotiations with the police, but the police simply refused to answer the phone. By the middle of that day, the robbers stopped in the district of Huckelried in Bremen, where they parked at a vegetable market in order to call the police. One of the hostages complained about the dispatcher's refusal to speak with the robbers and told their captor that the police were likely watching them at that very second. Rosner and Degowski became agitated and drew their guns, pointing them at the hostages and walking them to a nearby bus stop. Traffic was still operating normally in Bremen despite the armed robbers walking through the streets, and the only form of transportation that had been temporarily closed was the tram system. This meant that the buses were packed with even more people than normal, and the robbers hijacked a bus with 32 people aboard. Media personnel were able to get on the bus and interview the robbers, snapping pictures of both the perpetrators and their hostages. The police set up marksmen in neighboring buildings, while undercover officers entered the bus without the robbers' knowledge. Rosner and Degowski released 5 elderly hostages, but refused to let any others go. A press photographer named Peter Meyer relayed the robbers' demands to the police, which included a new getaway car, a fresh set of handcuffs, and a restrained police officer in exchange for the hostages. Rosner felt so confident about the situation that he left the bus at several points to speak with journalists, and he threatened to murder the hostages before taking his own life. Rosner attempted to contact the police with a reporter's car phone, but the police still refused to speak with him. As the sun started to set, Rosner saw one of the marksmen in a building opposite the bus, and he became enraged. He pressed his handgun against the head of 9-year-old Tatiana De Giorgio and crouched behind her to shield himself. After this, they forced the bus driver to leave Bremen. Police and media journalists followed the bus, and Rosner opened fire on a taxi that he falsely believed was an undercover cop. They eventually arrived at a rest stop in Grunberg See, near the municipality of Skottrum. Rosner and Degowski released the 2 bank employees, but they kept the rest of the hostages. Degowski performed a TV interview while holding a woman named Silke Bischoff at gunpoint. Silke was a trainee in a lawyer's office in Bremen, and she had finished work an hour before her friend that day. She waited for her friend, Ines Voetle, so that they could take the bus together. While Marian was using the bathroom at the rest stop, 2 Bremen police officers arrested her without authorization. Rosner and Degowski were furious, and they demanded a hostage exchange. They told the police that they would start killing hostages unless Marian was returned to them. The bus driver, along with Peter Meyer, convinced the police to return Marian, but it was too late. The arresting officer had turned off his radio and struggled to unlock the handcuffs, which made them late to the hostage exchange. Degowski shot a 14-year-old boy named Emmanuel Di Giorgio in the head. Emmanuel had been on the bus with his parents, and Degowski had tried to take his sister instead of him, but he stepped in the way and sacrificed himself. Paramedics arrived on scene and dragged Emmanuel away from the bus. He was transported to the nearest hospital, but died 2 hours later. At around 11:45 p.m., the bus started driving toward the Netherlands. Rosner had decided to do this because someone had told him that the police were friendlier there. Rosner and Degowski ordered the hostages to stand in front of the bus windows as human shields. The police continued to follow the bus, and one of the police cruisers collided with a truck during the chase, killing one officer and injuring the other. At 2:28 a.m. on August 18th, the bus crossed the border into the Netherlands, where most of the press vehicles were stopped by Dutch police. At 5:15 a.m., Rosner and Degowski released most of the women and all of the children because the Dutch police refused to negotiate while children were involved. At one point, Rosner accidentally discharged his weapon, hitting Marian in the leg and the bus driver in the hand. The police opened fire on the bus in response to the gunshot, but they did not hit anyone. At 6:30 a.m., the police gave Rosner and Degowski a BMW as a getaway car. They had rigged the vehicle so that the engine could be shut off via remote control, but the police forgot to bring the remote with them, so this would turn out to be useless. All the remaining hostages were released except for 2, Silke Bischoff and Ines Foltley. Degowski had become interested in Silke back in Bremen, and he was determined to take her with him. The police assumed that Rosner would take Marian to one of the nearby hospitals to treat her gunshot wound, so they stationed officers in 2 hospitals that were near the highway. Instead of going to the hospital, Rosner forced the bus driver to go to Cologne because he wanted to see the cathedral. They stopped in the city of Wuppertal to go shopping with the stolen money. At this point in time, a fresh wave of journalists had swarmed the robbers, which made it very difficult for the police to follow them. Some of the reporters even offered to give the robbers photographs of police officers in order to avoid any undercover trickery during a hostage exchange. The police issued orders to launch a rescue effort for the hostages, but the protocol did not allow this because the police were forbidden from using their firearms in such close proximity to civilians. A group of undercover cops, led by a man named Rainer Kesting, were planning to restrain Rosner and shoot Degowski, but their plan fell through when they remembered that they had to leave their weapons in the car. Journalists eventually notified Rosner about the undercover cops, and Rosner pointed his gun at the crowd. Most of the civilians ran away, but the journalists continued taking pictures. Following this, a reporter named Udo Robel shouted for the crowd to disperse so that the robbers could drive away. Rosner asked for directions to the Autobahn, then offered to have Robel tag along with them as a navigator. Robel agreed and guided the robbers for several kilometers back into Germany before being dropped off at the city of Siegburg. From there, Rosner and Degowski started driving on the Autobahn, and they told the 2 remaining hostages that they would be released at dawn. The police, who were still following the robbers, ended up receiving orders to arrest the perpetrators, and the potential death of the hostages was labeled as an acceptable risk. Near the town of Bad Honnef, a police car rammed into the getaway car. Degowski was knocked unconscious, but Marian ducked down into the legroom while Rosner opened fire at the police car. Officers fired a total of 62 shots into the car, one of which ricocheted into Ines, but she managed to escape the vehicle nonetheless. However, Silke was struck in the heart and died on scene. After a 5-minute firefight, Rosner and Degowski surrendered by throwing their weapons out of the car. They were immediately arrested. On March 22nd of 1991, both men were found guilty and received life sentences. Marian was sentenced to 9 years for her involvement. The higher court refused an application for parole that was submitted by Rosner in 2004. In the immediate aftermath of this case, the Minister of the Interior of Bremen, a man named Bernd Meyer, resigned as a result of the incompetence that his police force had demonstrated. The media was also heavily criticized for their involvement, with some people arguing that the crisis could have been stopped earlier if the press had not interfered. The German Press Council has since banned interviews with hostage takers. There are a bevy of photographs from this case, each of which has the same disturbing backstory. Police incompetence and media interference resulted in 2 hostages and 1 police officer losing their lives. Click the join button to become a member today. Channel members receive exclusive content as well as early access to all my content. This is a photograph of Andrei Karlov, the Russian ambassador to Turkey from July 12th of 2013 to December 19th of 2016. In the photo, Karlov is giving a speech at the opening of an art exhibit in Ankara, Turkey. He had been invited to speak after a period of very high tension between Turkey and Russia, with many Turks protesting the Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war. The nations had plans to negotiate a settlement. This picture was taken on December 19th of 2016, the day that Karlov would not only lose his career, but also his life. You see this man in the background? This man is Mevlut Altintas, an off-duty Turkish police officer who had gained entry to the exhibit with his police badge. Everybody thought that he was part of the security force, but Altintas had other plans. In the middle of the speech, Altintas fired several shots into Karlov's back, which killed the ambassador and injured several others. After the shooting, Altintas circled the room, shouting in both Arabic and Turkish, "Allahu Akbar, we are the descendants of those who supported the Prophet Muhammad for jihad. Do not forget Aleppo. Do not forget Syria. We die in Aleppo. You die here." Turkish security forces arrived on scene and fatally shot Altintas. Karlov was rushed to a hospital, but he died from his injuries. The motivation for the murder seemed to be revenge from Russian military involvement in Aleppo. Altintas was investigated under suspicion of being involved with Sunni anti-Assad groups, while Russian officials claimed that the purpose of the assassination was to damage relations between Russia and Turkey. The murder was praised by social media accounts that were connected to various terrorist organizations, such as Al-Qaeda. The Turkish president at the time, Tayyip Erdogan, attributed the assassination to the Gulen movement, a Sunni Islamic brotherhood based in Turkey, but no evidence was ever found to support this claim. The Turkish police arrested Altintas's family and flatmate in Ankara, but they were only detained for 1 day. Turkish prosecutors stated that Altintas's Gmail had been completely wiped 2.5 hours after the assassination, when Altintas was already dead. It's unclear exactly how this happened or why, because the emails have never been recovered.